Today, we're going to talk to Glenn Williams. And let me tell you a little bit about Glenn, who I've known for probably over 15 years. Glenn is an historian at the U.S. Army Center of Military History at Fort McNair in downtown D.C. He has served as an historian on the National Museum of the U.S. Army's History Project Office years ago. Also, the Army's Lewis and Clark Bicentennial Commemoration and the National Park Service's American Battlefield Protection Program. He's the author of a number of books and articles, including the award-winning Year of the Hangman, which I have right here, highly recommended. It is about George Washington's campaign against the Iroquois. And most recently, as you saw from the opening screen, Dunmore's War, the last conflict of America's colonial era. So Glenn, before we turn it over to you, I want to welcome you and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, John. Good to be with you.
Good. All right, I'm gonna turn it over to you so you can run your slides and tell us all about Dunmore's War of 1774. And when you wrap up, we'll open it up for questions.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I want to give a quick special shout out to Jamie Rife, who's listening, who we met. He actually wrote his master's thesis on Dunmore's War. So we're part of that very narrow circle of Dunmore's War scholars. Now, a lot of people ask why I write the book, and these are the questions I wanted to answer as I went through it. And one of my favorites are the last two. You know, always hear that the Virginia militia fought Indian style. I'm making air quotes. Sorry you can't see me. My camera isn't functioning. But I wanted to bust the myth that the militia fought Indian style, and a few other things that I hope to answer as we go along. As you can see, these questions, if I don't answer one you're interested in, please ask during the Q&A. You can even ask me why I do not think the Battle of Point Pleasant was the real first battle of the American Revolution. Just a little background. The imperial issues following the French and Indian War are looming large. You can see the map of the colonies there by its royal charter. Virginia not only encompassed what is now current Virginia and West Virginia, but also Kentucky, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and on west to sea to Shining Sea. When he became governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore actually promoted the westward expansion of the Virginia colony. And we all know after the French and Indian War, the king imposed the Royal Proclamation, which drew an arbitrary line along the headwaters of those rivers that flowed towards the Mississippi. Everything west of that was supposed to be reserved for the Indians as their hunting ground. When people cite this, they usually forget the next sentence, which says, "until our future pleasure be known." And that future pleasure came rather quick when the line that marked the limits of expansion had to be changed. Virginia at this time was dealing mostly with the two most powerful Indian polities on the North American continent, the Six Nations of Iroquois in the north and the Cherokee in the south. And we'll talk a little more about those in a little while. As I said, by 1766 or so, people realized the proclamation line wasn't really working. So the Lords of the Board of Trade directed the two Indian superintendents, Sir William Johnson in the north and Colonel John Campbell in the south, to renegotiate with those Indian nations to move the line of settlement back a little further. And basically in the north with the Six Nations, it was done at the Treaty of Fort Stanwix in 1768. And with the Cherokee, with the treaties of Hard Labor Creek and Lochaber in 69 and 70, and then a special agreement with the Cherokees in 1771. And to make a long story short, it basically moved the line open to settlement to follow along the Ohio River as far as the Louisa or Kentucky River in present day Kentucky. And added to that, you can imagine other things going on within the colonies, that there was a consortium of business operatives in Philadelphia and London that wanted to establish a 14th colony, an inland colony that they wanted to call Vandalia, which would take up a lot of what's currently West Virginia and some of Kentucky. And you can imagine which colony that kind of ticked off, Virginia, of course. And there was an ongoing controversy over the forks of the Ohio, whether it belonged to Pennsylvania or Virginia. So there was a lot of tense issues surrounding that between those two colonies. And just to talk about the Virginia militia a little bit, it's one of my favorite subjects. The authority of the Virginia Royal Governor had the following points that he could do. And the one I like to point out the most is appoint officers. As we hear about the Minutemen who elected their own officers, or in New England, it was not the case in Virginia. The officers were appointed. And I'll get in a little further than that. Basically, the colonels and they call them the county lieutenants and field officers were appointed by the governor with the consent of his colonial council. And whereas we'll talk about the company officers in a little bit. You notice some of his responsibilities for defense of the colony. He could march troops anywhere within the colony. He raised regiments, either provincials or militia, call militia into active service, or raise regulars. He could draft men. We don't usually think about the militia drafting, and I'll get a little more into that later on. He could also impress equipment such as boats and such, supplies, provisions, and so forth. But most of the day-to-day administration of the colony fell to the county lieutenants, and I'll talk more about those in a minute. The governor, through his prerogatives, had the power of the sword, and you can see some of the powers that he had militarized on the slides that's there now. The basic function of the militia was to defend the colony from invasion, suppress rebellions, and pursue enemies out of the province. He could also establish fortifications, and in time of war, proclaim martial law and issue letters of marque and reprisal to privateers. But his main function was to arm, muster, and command all persons within the colony for the defense of the colony. Now, the county lieutenants, very important people. Each county had a county lieutenant, held the rank of colonel, and regardless of how many other colonels might have been in the colony to command in the county to command regiments, the county lieutenant was the supreme officer, the commander-in-chief of the militia in that county. His job was to divide the county up into 10 companies regionally, okay? These weren't TO&E companies that we would say today. They weren't tactical companies, they were administrative. All the able-bodied white males that lived in that part of the county were members of a company. The county lieutenant appointed the captains. The captains, in conjunction with the county lieutenant, appointed the subalterns, or the lieutenants and the ensigns. The captain and the subalterns would in turn appoint the NCOs. The NCOs could not refuse the duty. In fact, if they refused to be sergeants or corporals, they could get fined. He had similar duties to the governor, in that in his county, he could raise and order men to march anywhere in the county, made sure that they had the proper arms and accoutrements, and he had the responsibility to exercise and discipline them. So the training fell to him. According to the colony's militia law, all adult male white males aged 18 to 60 were listed. Note that it says listed, not enlisted. Now, I give some talks sometime, people say, well, my great, whatever, joined the militia. Well, no, in this period, you didn't join the militia. When you turned 18, you were in the militia. Each militiaman had to have a stand of arms, a musket and a cartridge box and a bayonet. Or if he lived on the frontier, he could substitute a rifle, a powder horn, and a shot pouch, and a tomahawk in lieu of the bayonet. Some people were exempt from assembling at musters. such as members of the local court or members of the colonial assembly. But if they were exempt from drilling, they had to provide arms and accoutrements for the poorer men in the county so they could drill. The companies were exercised in what were called a private muster 4 times a year. And the county lieutenant mustered the entire county's battalion once a year in a general muster. Now, they would do this more often in wartime, of course. And I'd like to point out that the militia did their duty without pay. The musters were unpaid, and if they were called out on an alarm, they didn't start getting paid until they had been on duty for at least a week. And they would train. Everybody trained in the manual 1764. However, on the frontier, they also trained in light infantry tactics, bush fighting, as it was called, which kind of combined the irregular warfare, petite guerre that was practiced in Europe, adapted to the American woods. So, I don't like to say the militia fought Indian style. They had a style of fighting Indians instead. I won't go through all the things that led up to Lord Dunmore's War, but it basically followed those treaties that we talked about earlier, and clash of cultures, because the 6 nations who claimed dominion over all the Indian territories in the area didn't bother to consult with the Indian tribes or nations that actually lived in that area. So some of them found themselves within the area of settlement and were ordered by the 6 nations that they had to move to west of the Ohio. And the ones that felt most aggrieved with this were the Shawnee. And we can talk more about that later if you want. But they seem to be the most hostile. There was a time when the Cherokees looked like they were going to go to war with Virginia as well. But that was resolved through negotiations before it turned into a fighting war. As tensions in the border increased, people started writing letters to the Virginia Gazette. One of them read, like the headline there, "War is necessary, nay, inevitable," because of what was going on. A lot of Indian raiding parties were crossing the Ohio and attacking settlements through the course of 1774, leading up to the actual outbreak of the war. And the Shawnees started to exert control over the river and attacking, like I said, attacking settlements on the south bank of the Ohio. As the tensions increased, Lord Dunmore sent out a proclamation to the county lieutenants in the frontier counties to be on your guard. That's all he said, was be on your guard. Not only to protect their citizens against possible Indian raids, but also from the Pennsylvanians, who were getting kind of getting a little belligerent over the Virginia takeover of the forks of the Ohio. Now, the war really breaks out when a group of settlers, not embodied as militia, at a place called Baker's Bottom, invite some Mingo Indians, who are actually part of the 6 nations and peaceful, by the way, over for some carousing and drinking under the guise of having a marksmanship competition. These guys, led by a guy named Greathouse, proceeded to get the Indians drunk and then murdered them, several of them, including women and children. And some of them were relatives of a Mingo leading warrior named John Logan. Logan was not there at the time. He comes home to find out his family is murdered. He swears revenge, and he wants to go to war. The Shawnees are already itching for a fight. So the Shawnees gladly take John Logan and his Mingo warriors along as allies, and they begin launching series of raids on the south bank of the Ohio against the settlements. In the course of this, after Greathouse and his ruffians murdered Logan's family at Baker's Bottom, a lot of other settlers realize that this is going to start a war, and they start to leave the frontier area. Like I said, the Shawnees are the ones that are mostly belligerent, and they seek allies among the other nations on the north bank of the Ohio and from the 6 nations. But really interesting in the way that Indian diplomacy works at this time. The Six Nations are dead set against this. They are British allies, and they tell the other nations under their dominion, because they claim the right of conquest over the whole Ohio Valley. They tell those nations under their dominion that if they go to war against the British, they will answer diplomatically, economically, and militarily to the Six Nations. So this virtually leaves the Shawnee without any real allies, except the band of Mingos under Logan, and some tribesmen that defy their tribal leaders and join with the Shawnee. Dunmore sends out instructions to his county lieutenants to stand ready to defend their counties or march the assistance in neighboring counties to build and improve their fortifications. And the main thing was to try to get the settlers not to evacuate their farms and settlements, but to stay there. And I'll get into that in a little bit. And to use rangers and scouts. Now, rangers and scouts were part of the militia, and they were usually put on extended active duty, or what they called actual service in those days. And they're kind of similar. Rangers, don't think the Spencer Tracy movie when Rogers Rangers, nothing like that. Rangers in Virginia in this period for frontier defense. They would patrol the frontier to give early warning that there was an Indian war party coming towards the settlements, and then they would help the militia at whatever area was targeted to repel the invasion. Scouts are similar, but they worked in smaller parties and they were closer to the settlements. Named 4 or 5 men to go out on a scout. They would see what had been an Indian camp. They'd go back and tell the local captain of militia that there's a war party in the area. He would alarm his militia, and they would stand ready to defend their settlement. They also build fortifications. This is one thing I like to bring out too. When you read the period stuff, if it's Fort Williams, for instance, that means it was a militia installation paid for the government. If it was Williams Fort, on the other hand, it was the family's home that was fortified and could have militia assigned to it in emergency, but it was basically a private fortification. Indian raids continued through July and August. The militia tries to respond. Lord Dunmore gets 1 battalion of Virginia militiamen under what's his name? He's having a mental fun. Angus MacDonald leads a battalion of about 400 militiamen to the south bank of the south bank of the Ohio. They raid the Indian town of Wacatamika. Doesn't change the course of the war at all. It kind of ticks off the Indians, the Shawnee in particular, because it targeted the Shawnee, but doesn't really change the trajectory of the war. And that's the only incursion into Shawnee territory the Virginians execute until we get to the final offensive that I'm going to talk about in a couple minutes. Dunmore decides he's going to take the offense. He's going to lead a large-scale invasion targeting the main towns of the Shawnee Indians, probably in the area around Scioto. Why is he going to do it? Well, best way to do it is take the fight to the enemy. You can be strong number-wise in total numbers of men, but you can't be strong everywhere all at the same time. So you take the fight the enemy, it's less expensive, it's more likely to put an end to the war, and it breaks your enemy's military power. How is he going to do it? He's going to call out the militia to form 2 divisions that'll converge from 2 different directions, one from the north, one from the south. They will unite, combine their forces. And originally the plan was to do this at the mouth of the Hockhocking River and march inland into Shawnee territory and attack the Shawnee towns, using the basic colonial British tactic when fighting Indians of the strategic offense and tactical defense. Now, what does this mean? This means that they move into Indian territory in force the Indians to come and attack them. Why they do this? Because it faces the strength of the colonial or British force, mass firepower, usually behind fortifications. And it's a battle that the militia and British regulars would prefer to fight if they're fighting Indians. Dunmore originally thinks about forming regiments of provincial regulars. He's denied this by the House of Burgesses because they're always looking at the money. They have the responsibility for raising money in the colony. And they tell him that they're not going to pay for provincial regulars because you have to pay them as soon as they enlist, and they're on duty until their terms of enlistment are up, and then you have to pay them. But they tell Lord Dunmore that he has the authority to call out the militia, which in turn are cheaper because they're only going to be paid for the exact time that they're on duty, and they can be released when they're no longer needed. So has the authority to call out the militia. I know it's kind of hard to see on this slide, but this is the seat of war for Lord Dunmore's war. You can see it goes in the north from around the Pittsburgh area, the Forks of the Ohio, down along the Ohio River into what's now southwestern Virginia and West Virginia, and the Indian towns along the Scioto River. The Northern Division, or right wing of the Army, is going to be under the command of Colonel Adam Stephen, although Dunmore is going to travel with them. So, it's kind of like Grant traveling with the Army of the Potomac. It's under General Meade during the Civil War, who was really in charge. Dunmore, as the commander-in-chief, of course, is the leading figure, although Adam Stephen has responsibility for this wing of the Army. They're going to muster at two different places, Winchester in Virginia and around what's now Pittsburgh, and they'll descend the Ohio to Hockhocking Creek. They're going to draw militia from Frederick, Dunmore, Berkeley, and Hampshire counties. And I have the West Augusta district, but that wasn't really named till 1776, but you get the idea. Those are the three counties around Pittsburgh. Because they don't all have arms or sufficient arms, Dunmore calls out back to Williamsburg for 300 stands of arms out of the magazine at Williamsburg. The Southern Division, or left wing of the Army, is going to go up the Ohio. Originally, the plan was to meet at the Hockhocking River, but it gets changed. And it's going to be commanded by Colonel Andrew Lewis. Andrew Lewis is probably the most dynamic leader on the frontier at this time. His militia service goes back, I think, to King George's War. He was a major in the Virginia Regiment when George Washington commanded it. And he has a long history of militia service. And he's probably, and Indian diplomacy as well. And he's going to be in charge of the militia, 1,300 strong, mostly from Augusta, Bodytot, and Fincastle counties, but also a couple of companies from Dunmore, Bedford, and Culpeper counties. They will assemble at Camp Union, which is where Lewisburg, West Virginia is now. And from there, they'll march down to the Kanawha River, and from there ascend the Kanawha and then the Ohio. But their orders get changed. They are instead to go to the mouth of the Kanawha, where it empties into the Ohio, a place called Point Pleasant. This advance is about 160 miles long. They're going to march across the mountains to the Kanawha River, not too far from where Charleston, West Virginia is now. They'll march in three different march orders. The first two get to the mouth of the river, the Elk River, where they will build a magazine. They shuttle supplies by pack horse train from Camp Union to the mouth of the Elk River. At the Elk River, they not only build magazines, but they build boats to transport most of the supplies, since they don't have enough pack horses to carry it all on their backs. From there, the first two march orders, mostly the Bodytot and Augusta County lines, march along the river as their supplies move by river down to Point Pleasant, where they establish a camp. The third march order, mostly this Fincastle County line, marches a few days behind them. They're bringing along more pack animals, and they're also bringing the beef on the hoof for the provisions. The first two march orders arrive at Point Pleasant around the 6th of October, about the same time as the First Continental Congress is starting to meet in Philadelphia. The scouts report that they've seen some Indian hunting parties in the area, but nothing to worry about, no war parties. And they established their camp at the very base of the point where the two rivers, the confluence of the two rivers, the Augusta County line basically facing the Kanawha River, and the Botetourt County line facing the Ohio River. They start building corrals for their pack animals and cattle, and magazines for their ammunition, and settling in. About this time, Lord Dunmore says, well, come on and join me up at the mouth of Hockhocking so we can move against this, the principal Shawnee towns. Lewis and the other officers say, well, we are closer to the towns here. Why should we march there? And Dunmore changes the order to they can cross the Ohio there and meet him outside of the Indian towns later on. Meanwhile, Cornstalk, who commands the Shawnee Indians and whatever volunteers join them from the other tribes and the Mingos, they have about 800 warriors. And as you saw from the slides before, he's facing about 2,500 militiamen. They are divided. The only chance Cornstalk has of defeating them is to defeat one wing of the army, hurry back, and defeat the other, where he can reduce the odds. So he takes his 800, maybe as many as 1,000, but probably closer to 800 warriors down to near Point Pleasant. They cross the Ohio to an abandoned Indian town, which is referred to as Old Town, where they camp for the night on the 9th of October after rafting, building small rafts and crossing the Ohio. They're going to prepare to attack early in the morning, the 10th of October, the next day. Their intent is to completely surprise the Virginia camp, pin them against the Kanawha River, and either force them into the river or force them to retreat back up the Kanawha. And then he can turn around and defeat the other wing of the army under Dunmore closer to home. Now, on the morning of the 10th, the Augusta County line, the Botetourt County line has two Fincastle counties attached to it. And as they move into Point Pleasant, Lewis decides that they're going to slaughter the less healthy, less beefy steers first, so that food is poorer quality. They're going to save the better cattle for later on in the expedition. Some of the company commanders didn't like this decision very much, some of the line commanders, so they start sending out hunting parties to supplement their men's rations with game. So on the morning of the 10th, two hunting parties from two different Fincastle County companies go out hunting into the woods early in the morning, about the time reveille is beating, but the men aren't to arms. They're just waking up and starting to cook their breakfast. And as these two hunting parties, 2 men each, are looking for deer, they stumble onto the Indians. One of them reports that he stepped onto an open field and he couldn't cross the field without stepping on a sleeping Indian. The Indians are aroused. They respond. They open fire on the two hunting parties. One of the hunters is killed. His partner makes it back. The other 2-man party make it back without being hurt. And as they run past the pickets, they yell out the challenge and password and get back to the captain of the guard. And they tell the captain of the guard that they just saw a whole lot of Indians out there. Immediately, the drummers beat to arms. The militia starts to assemble. Colonel Lewis comes out and he calls in his 2 principal subordinates, his brother Charles Lewis, who's commanding the Augusta County line, who will be on the right, and William, what's his name? William Fleming, who commands the Augusta County line on the left. Probably the worst decision that Lewis ever makes in his military career. Instead of ordering out companies intact, he tells the 2 colonels to pick your 6 best captains, the first 150 men from each line, and go out and see what's in front of us. Charles Lewis's column is going to be on the right. They're going to follow Crooked Creek. William Fleming's column of Augusta Botetourt troops are going to be on the left. They're going to follow along the bank of the Ohio, 150 men each, about a half a mile apart. and they're going to advance to see what Indians are in front of them. Lewis and the other officers think what they're facing is a scouting party, maybe a big scouting party, but a scouting party nonetheless. They get about a half a mile from the camp. They're marching in column, and the Indians open fire. Charles Lewis is mortally wounded in the first volley. Fleming is seriously wounded in the first volley on his side, on the left-hand column, and the 250-man columns start to deploy into line, but there's a gap between them. They're trying to close this gap, and the Indians are pushing them back. They're retreating closer and closer to the camp, to where the people in the camp standing behind their breastwork can see the fighting going on. Andrew Lewis knows they need help, so he selects Colonel Field to lead 250 reinforcements forward. These 250 reinforcements are mostly the companies, from the same companies as those 150 men from each side are up ahead. So they'll make their companies whole, but for now they're separated. And they had a problem, because some of these officers, they know their men, but as they're advancing, they see some of the soldiers that were in the initial fight starting to peel back without orders, because they're not following their own company commanders. To their credit, the lieutenants and the ensign get them back into line. They move back. They finally reestablish a solid line across the entire point, but they're still being pushed back little by little. And in the meantime, Colonel Field gets killed. So you have all three subordinate field grade officers are seriously wounded or dead. And the battle falls to the command of Evan Shelby, captain, who stabilizes the line. The line is finally solid from the Crooked Creek all the way to the Ohio. The retreat finally halts about the time the Indians reach the limit of their capability, and they start to pull back. They don't want to stand up fight. They don't want a fight that's going to be a slugfest. They're going to gather their wounded and dead. They retreat to a hill. You can see the shaded area on the map. The Virginians are not going to attempt a frontal assault against Indians defending on high ground. So they continue to trade musketry between them. Finally, the Indians start dragging off their dead and wounded and rafting the wounded across the Ohio, burying the dead as best they can or throwing them into the river. And Cornstalk makes the decision they're going to retreat back to their principal towns on the Scioto River. After he collects his own dead and wounded and builds better fortifications, and the Fincastle County line catches up, Lewis is going to cross the Ohio in order to join with Dunmore outside of the principal Indian towns on the Scioto River. In the meantime, Dunmore has stolen the march on the Indians, and he is almost to their principal towns on the Scioto. And they establish a fortified camp called Camp Charlotte on a place called Pickaway Plains. Cornstalk calls his subordinate leaders together and says, okay, we've taken a lot of casualties. We have Dunmore facing our principal towns. We have the choice. We can either kill our women and children, burn our town and cornfields, and then attack Camp Charlotte, or we can seek peace terms, whatever terms that Dunmore will give us. They agree with Cornstalk that he should talk with Dunmore. So Cornstalk approaches Dunmore, Camp Charlotte, to see what kind of peace terms he can get if they stop fighting. And they are surprised that they are extremely lenient. Dunmore's terms include no demand for Indians ceding land. He demands that they only recognize the boundary between Virginia and Indian Territory as the Ohio, as was determined by the Six Nations at the Fort Stanwix Treaty. He demands that they return all captives that they have taken in raids on the South Bank, and any captives that they still have that were taken during Pontiac's War, the French and Indian War, that were never repatriated after the treaties that ended those wars. They're also to return any horses they took in raids on the South Bank. And they are also supposed that the Shawnees primarily traded with Pennsylvania traders. So Dunmore demands that they give what we would call most favored nation status to Virginia traders following the war. The most harsh, we would say harsh, term of the treaty is they are to surrender 6 hostages, either chiefs or sons of chiefs. Now, I say we would think this is harsh. When we think hostage, don't think of a hostage crisis or you're holding people for ransom or something like that. In the 18th century, when you were fighting Indians and they were starting to lose, in order to extricate themselves from a losing battle, they would usually ask for terms of a treaty. Usually, as the case was here, it would be temporary, a ceasefire, an armistice, and they would agree later to negotiate the final or official treaty. Well, in order that they would not use this armistice to withdraw themselves from a losing battle, the British or colonists would tell the Indians, okay, if you want a treaty, you're going to have to submit six hostages, chiefs or sons of chiefs, and they would stay at Williamsburg. No, they weren't thrown in the jail at Williamsburg. They were given complete freedom of the town, but they had to stay in Williamsburg until the following March, when the final treaty would be completed and signed in Fort Pitt. So that's what they mean by this. In fact, we have primary sources where people in Winchester would talk about seeing the 6 Indian chiefs coming through their town, heading to Williamsburg. They're not under guard, they're not shackled, they're not tied or anything like that. They were respected as leaders and gentlemen and permitted freedom to travel as they would, as long as they stayed in Williamsburg. Those are the harshest treaties, the harshest terms of the treaty. Now, the only holdout, of course, is Logan. Logan is still feeling aggrieved, of course. His family was murdered. He tries to escape with some of his Mingo followers, and he's chased down by the militia and brought to terms. And he has a meeting with John Gibson, who's a Pennsylvania trader, would later be a colonel in the Continental Army. He also is married to a relative of Logan, so they have a connection there. So during the course of talking with Logan, he gives his famous lament. It's printed in the Virginia Gazette. If you read Thomas Jefferson's Current State of Virginia, it's in there as an example of Indian eloquence. If you read it, it's like, when did a white man ever come to Logan's cabin and not find food if he was hungry, or something to wear if he was naked? Now, it kind of reads like the Gospel of St. Matthew. But Logan's lament was taught in schools for years afterwards. And this essentially ends the war. The militia marches back to where it started the campaign from. 3 forts are left on the frontier: Fort Pitt, Fort Fincastle, which is where Wheeling, West Virginia is now, and Fort Randolph, which is at Point Pleasant. They'll be garrisoned by militia on active duty for a while. The rest of the militia marches home and is dismissed. Lord Dunmore goes back to Williamsburg. He's been away since July. You can imagine when you come back to your office after being away for a couple months, your email is piled up and your inbox is full. Well, he did the same thing. After he's toasted and feted and given votes of thanks by everybody you can think of in the colony, and treated like a hero, when he comes back, he sits down, he opens up a letter from the Secretary of State for the colonies. He said, "Where the heck have you been? Did you know there was this General Congress that met in Philadelphia? How many people from your colony attended?" And pretty much you executed this war that nobody wanted, and we haven't been able to get in touch with you, and send me a report. So it's from here that Dunmore goes from the height of his popularity, as it slowly erodes, as the 13 colonies move closer and closer to rebellion, which will break out in April of 1775. But that's not the purpose of this story. So we're going to conclude with Dunmore's War. It was not fought as a land grab, as I mentioned, by the terms of the treaty that ended the battle. The Indians were not all peaceful. The Shawnees were itching for a fight from the beginning of the story. Virginia fought mainly a defensive war. All the battles except that one raid on Wakatamika and the final offensive to put an end to the war. All the other fighting took place on the South Bank in Virginia, the South Bank of the Ohio. Some people think it was an attempt by Dunmore to divert people from the colonists from the coming revolution. When they started the military operation against the Indians, it was still redress of grievances. Even George Washington, in a letter to a British officer that had served under him in the French and Indian War, says, "We are not looking for independence. We're merely seeking redress of grievances from the from various coercive acts." The Virginia militia, like I said before, had their own style of fighting, bush fighting, light infantry tactics, based on Humphrey Bland's instructions for fighting an irregular enemy in an enclosed territory, adapted to the American wilderness. Yes, influenced some by their Indian allies or Indian enemies, but basically something different, bush fighting, not Indian style. So unless you have any questions, this concludes my presentation, and I thank you very much.
Thank you, Glenn. We do have some questions, but thanks very much for your presentation, and especially the slides, the maps. It really enhances things. One of the questions you just touched on, but one of our audience members wants to know about Adam Stephen and George Washington. And is that the same Adam Stephen that Washington would later
Relieve?
have relieve and have trouble with? And if you could also, you mentioned about George Washington, his letter, but there's another question about what was Washington's either role in this, and if he didn't have an active role, what was his opinion about the campaign?
Okay, a couple things. Yes, it is the same Adam Stephen. Adam Stephen, I think, was the last commander of the Virginia Regiment during the French and Indian War after Washington resigned, if I'm not mistaken. And he served honorably in the Revolution until he got fired. We won't go into that, but yes, it is the same guy. Washington, before the war started, Washington had volunteered to take Dunmore on a tour of the Western frontier. Washington, of course, had property out there. About the time they were supposed to leave is when his stepdaughter, Patsy, died of epilepsy, and he couldn't go, but he arranged for another Virginia regiment veteran named Crawford to act as Dunmore's guide through the Western districts. I think Washington would have supported the war because I know he supported the war because when the Indian raids begin in spring of 1774, he has workmen working on his property, and he tells them all to go and join in with the militia companies out in the West. In fact, under Crawford, join Crawford's militia company to help in the defense of the frontier. Now, the name of the British officer escapes me, but he was a lieutenant in the 44th Regiment of Foot, I'm thinking. McAllister, it's a Scottish name. And they corresponded the whole time Washington is at the Continental Congress. And they're talking about what's going on between the lieutenant's talking about what's going on in Boston, and Washington is telling them what's going on in the Continental Congress. And basically it's redress of grievances. And remember, the Continental Congress comes up with the Continental Association that imposes non-importation, non-exportation agreements, and the local committees of observation that are supposed to run those. And in order to be separate from the militia that's under the control of the royal governors, they are encouraged to form companies of independent militia, and it's the Fairfax Independent Militia that Washington commands, and it is their uniform he wears when he goes to the Second Continental Congress. Does that answer all the questions, or am I missing?
Yeah, no, that hits both of those questions. Another audience member, actually two audience members, want to know where you got the cover illustration for the book on Dunmore's War. And tell us about that.
Okay, the cover illustration is by Pamela Patrick White of Historical Art Incorporated, I think it is, or Wright Historical Art. She and her husband Brent run that, and my publisher floated a few samples of what he wanted to use as the cover. The first, of course, was the ubiquitous Reynolds portrait of Dunmore in his kilt, painted in 1861. Well, we see that everywhere, and it doesn't really say anything about Dunmore's War. It was basically a campaign poster, I would call it, when he was a candidate to be a representative peer of Scotland in the House of Lords in Parliament. Didn't want to use that. He found another one that was supposed to be Squire Boone leading a train of pack horses over the mountains into Kentucky. And he said, well, Squire Boone is mentioned in the book in the first chapter. And he says, yeah, nowhere else. Because Squire Boone, Daniel's brother, it was on the expedition that gets ambushed on the way to the Ohio in late 1773. So I said, I don't really like any of these. In fact, if I saw the one of Squire Boone, I would think the book was about Lewis and Clark or something. So he says, well, if you can find a better illustration, find it. So I know Pamela and Brent, so I went to their website and I saw that illustration, and that looks like the Indian attack on the Spicer settlement that's mentioned in the book. And I said, this is perfect. So that's what we used.
It is perfect. Good. We also have a question from someone writing their dissertation on Rangers, partisans, and irregular operations during the Revolution.
Wow.
And his question is, you made a differentiation between Indian fighting and fighting like Indians or something like that.
Yes.
Can you elaborate on that?
Yes. Your frontier militia drew a lot from their experience fighting against Indians in previous wars. They were also influenced by Humphrey Bland's treatise on military discipline, and where he has a chapter, I think it's chapter 4, if I'm not mistaken, where he talks about fighting irregulars in an enclosed country. And Indians, when they fought, once the battle was joined, they mostly fought individual combats. Where was the strength of European armies? Well, it was in disciplined, cohesive units. Humphrey Bland talks about when you're going into a wooded country, you send a sergeant in command of 13 soldiers to search out the thickets. He talks about some of the things we talk about in modern combat, where you try to make contact with the smallest unit forward, but still within supporting distance of the main body. And he talks about things like that. And of course, fighting in open order. If you read a lot about the French and Indian War, light infantry tactics, their battle drill, the first command is take tree. So it kind of combines what the Europeans were doing in petite guerre in Europe, along with what they learned in the French and Indian War. And yes, some of the things that Americans learned from fighting alongside of Indian allies and against Indian enemies to come up with something different. Usually when militia tried to fight like Indians, they usually lost. Because, like I said, it usually devolved down into individual combats, whereas the militia with light infantry would attack where a file of men, 2 men, one would be having fired and the other was ready to fire. So while one was loading, the other was on standing guard. If you've read anything about the Battle of Oriskany, this is how the American line finally stabilized in Oriskany. Because the Indians would wait till a volley was fired and then attack when the men had to load. Well, the counter to that was at every file, 1 man would fire and 1 man would be ready to fire. So that's it in a nutshell. But I always point back to Humphrey Bland.
Well, speaking of combat, we have another question. What types of weapons were used by the various Native American forces?
Good question. By this time, most of them were armed with muskets of some kind. Of course, Indians either got their weapons from French or British allies from one of the previous wars, or trade weapons. Traders would barter, would pay Indians for pelts of one kind or another, and to keep the supply of pelts they would supply them with trade muskets. We probably assume that some of them had rifles, although they would usually have to take them to one of the Indian Department trading posts if they needed to be repaired, but they did. Indians also carrying war clubs. If you go out to the museum at Fort Pitt, they actually have one of Logan's war clubs that when he attacked a family called Snido during the course of the war, was left at the site with a note attached to it asking, "Why do you kill my people?" or something along that lines. But the ball, the solid ball on the end of the piece of wood war club was a standard weapon. By this time, I don't think very many Indians were still using the bow and arrow in combat in a large scale. I think they were mostly armed, like I said, with muskets of one kind or another, the war club, and of course their personal tomahawk and knife.
Again, Glenn, thanks very much for your participation today. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
And I want to thank our producer, Jen Davina, and also the audience members who gave up an hour during the week. And with that, I'll say have a good day. And again, we appreciate your support at the National Museum of the United States Army. Thank you.